Clara Whitfield pressed that warm loaf of bread against her chest, like it was the last thing she had left to hold on to, because it was. Behind her, two men on horseback were already turning onto her road papers in their hands and satisfaction in their eyes. She did not look back. She kept walking toward Elias Mercer's porch, one foot in front of the other, her jaw tight and her eyes dry. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of anyone today, not even him. If this story hits your heart, subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The Tuesday bread had started 11 months ago, almost by accident. Clara had baked too much that first week after the harvest came in, lighter than she could afford. Lighter than she had prayed for, but still something still enough to fill a loaf and feel like a human being for an hour or two. She had walked it across the dry stretch of land that separated her small homestead from Elias Mercer's property without thinking too hard about it. He had lost his wife the spring before. She had seen him working his fence line 3 evenings in a row, with no one bringing him water, no one calling him inside for supper. She figured a man like that could use a loaf of bread. He had opened his door, looking like she had caught him in the middle of something he was ashamed of, though she never could figure out what. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had spent 46 years doing real work. His hair had gone mostly gray. His eyes were dark brown, steady, the kind of eyes that didn't waste movement. He had looked at the bread, then at her, and said nothing for a long moment. "I didn't bring it because I pity you," Clara had told him, because she had the feeling he needed to hear that before he would take it. "I brought it because I made too much and bread doesn't keep." That was a lie. She had made exactly the right amount. She gave him half of it. He had taken it with both hands, the way a man takes something he's not sure he deserves, and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield." "Clara," she'd told him. "Clara," he'd repeated like he was testing whether the word fit. It had become a Tuesday ritual without either of them deciding it would. She brought bread. He sometimes had coffee ready. They sat on his porch for 20 minutes or an hour, depending on the work that was waiting, and they talked about the things people on the frontier talked about: weather, cattle prices, the state of the creek, the way the wind had been running from the wrong direction all month. They did not talk about loneliness. They did not need to. Clara had been widowed 2 years before Elias lost his wife. Thomas Whitfield had been a good man, a fair man, and she had loved him in the solid, unglamorous way that you love someone who shows up every single day without asking for applause. When he died of fever in the spring of 1880, he left her the homestead, 40 acres of wheatland, a barn that needed a new roof, and a debt to the Crow Bank that she had been working down one season at a time. She had been working it down. That was the thing people in town seemed to refuse to understand. She had been making payments, keeping records, managing her accounts with the kind of careful, deliberate attention that most of the men in Millhaven, Colorado, did not give her credit for. She knew her numbers. She knew her land. She knew what her wheat was worth and what the debt was, and how many more seasons of good harvest would clear it entirely. The problem was that Nathaniel Crow did not want it cleared. She had not understood that yet. On the Tuesday, she carried the last bread. The morning had started wrong. Clara woke before dawn, which was not unusual, and went to the barn to check on the 2 remaining horses, which was her habit, and found the smaller one favoring her front leg, which was a problem she did not have money to solve. She fed them both, made her calculations in her head the way she always did: feed costs, labor costs, the price per bushel. She could expect at harvest if the wheat came in the way it was looking, and went back inside to start the bread. She was pulling the loaf from the oven when she heard hoofbeats. She did not go to the window immediately. Hoofbeats on the road were not unusual. People passed. Ranch hands rode through. She set the loaf on the wooden board to cool and wiped her hands on her apron and told herself it was nothing. Then the hoofbeats slowed. Then they stopped. She went to the window. 2 men sat on horses in front of her gate. She recognized both of them. Denton Marsh worked at the Crow Bank, kept the ledgers, wore the same brown vest every day of his life. The man beside him she knew only as Rigby, One of the men Nathaniel Crow kept around for tasks that required size rather than intelligence. They were not moving. They were waiting. Clara stood at the window for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up the bread still warm, wrapped it in the cloth she had set out, and walked out the front door. She did not go toward the gate. She turned left toward the field path that led across to Elias's property. "Mrs. Whitfield." Denton Marsh's voice was polished the way a tool is polished smooth from use, not from care. "Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Crow has asked us to deliver a notice." "I can see you have papers," Clara said without stopping. "Leave them on the gate post. I'll read them when I get back." "Ma'am, this is time-sensitive in nature." "Everything on the frontier is time-sensitive," Clara said. "The wheat doesn't wait on rain. The rain doesn't wait on the wheat. I'm bringing bread to my neighbor. You can wait or you can leave, but I'm not standing in my own yard while strange men watch me read bad news." She heard Marsh say something to Rigby, low and frustrated. She kept walking. Elias saw her coming before she was halfway across. He had been at the fence on the western edge of his property, resetting a post that had heaved up through the winter freeze, and he straightened when he caught sight of her moving across the dry field, with that cloth-wrapped loaf held against her chest. He knew her walk. He had been watching it for 11 months without meaning to memorize it, but he had. She walked like a woman with a destination purposeful, measured no wasted motion. She was not walking like that now. She was walking like a woman who had made herself stop running. He set down the post driver and came to meet her at the fence line, ducking through the gap in the wire he used to cross to his north field. She was close enough by then that he could see her face, and what he saw made something in his chest go very still. Her jaw was set hard. Her eyes were clear, not red, not wet, not close to it, and that was the worst part. He had seen Clara Whitfield tired. He had seen her frustrated. He had once seen her laugh so hard at something he'd said about a mule that she had to put her hand on the fence post to steady herself. He had never seen her look like this, like she was holding something together with the force of her own will, and had been doing it for so long that the effort had become invisible. "You've got company," he said. "I noticed," she said. "2 of Crow's men." She looked at him. "You could see them from here." "I could see them from my porch. Been watching this road since Marsh rode past an hour ago to look at your gate numbers." He paused. "I thought I might be wrong about what it meant." "You weren't wrong," Clara said. She held out the bread. He took it the way he always did, with both hands. "I didn't come to ask for help," she said. "I want to say that before anything else. I came because—" She stopped, started again. "I came because this might be the last bread I ever bake from my own wheat. And I didn't want to let that pass without giving it to someone who would understand what it meant." Elias held the loaf and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What did the notice say?" "I haven't read it yet. I walked away before they could give it to me. But I know what it says." She crossed her arms, not in defiance, in the way a person holds themselves when they are cold from the inside. "Nathaniel Crow has been calling the debt. I knew he was going to. I've known it since last autumn, when he turned down my partial payment for the first time. He's never done that before. 3 years I've been making payments. He turned down the last 2. Elias went very still. He turned down payments. Said they weren't sufficient to satisfy the terms. But the terms haven't changed. I've read that contract 40 times, Elias. I know what it says. He's moving the line. And I—" She stopped again, and this time there was something close to anger in it, not grief. "I cannot fight him in that bank. I cannot fight him in front of his own men with his own paperwork. He has the town. He has the judge's brother on his payroll. He has every man in Millhaven who owes him a favor, and that's most of them. What's his deadline? Sundown today." Elias looked at the bread in his hands. He looked at her. He said, "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to go back and read that notice," Clara said. "I'm going to go to my house, and I'm going to take my deed out of the box where I keep it, and I'm going to read every word of it again. And then I'm going to go into town, and I'm going to stand in front of Nathaniel Crow and tell him the truth about what he's done, even if no one believes me, and even if it changes nothing. Because if I lose this land, I will not lose it quietly. Thomas died on that land. My father built the first structure on it with his own hands." She looked up at him, and her eyes were completely steady. "I will not be taken from it without saying what happened." Elias set the bread down on the fence post. "All right," he said. She blinked. "All right what?" "All right, I'm coming with you." Clara shook her head. "I told you I didn't come to ask." "You didn't ask," Elias said. "I'm telling." He picked the bread back up and handed it to her. "You carry that back to your house. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I need to change my shirt." She stared at him. "Elias, this is not your fight." He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that she didn't quite have a word for. Something that was not pity, and was not duty, and was not the quiet kindness of a neighbor. It was something older and more deliberate than any of those things. "No," he said. "It's not. But you are Clara." He walked back toward his house before she could answer. She read the notice on her kitchen table, with the bread cooling beside her, and her account ledger open in front of her. Denton Marsh had left it folded on the gatepost the way she'd told him. She had unfolded it walking back up the path and forced herself to read it slowly, which was the hardest thing she'd done all morning. The notice was written in the clean, impersonal language that powerful men use when they want to look like they are following rules instead of breaking them. It stated that Clara Ann Whitfield had failed to satisfy the outstanding debt on the property located at the Whitfield Homestead, Millhaven Township, Jefferson County, Colorado, in the amount of $412. It stated that per the terms of the original loan agreement, the Crow Bank had the right to demand full payment upon the borrower's failure to meet scheduled installment requirements. It stated that payment in full was required by 5 o'clock in the afternoon of this date, the 14th of May, 1882, and that failure to produce payment would result in the immediate transfer of the property deed to the Crow Bank. $412. Clara sat with that number for a moment. $412 was not a number she could produce. It was more than a full season's income on her current acreage. It was, she suspected, designed to be exactly that, more than she could possibly gather in a single day, more than any neighbor could lend, more than any emergency sale of livestock would cover. She opened her ledger to the page she had been keeping for 3 years. Every payment she had made to the Crow Bank was recorded there in her own handwriting, with dates and amounts and the running balance. She had made 27 payments. She had turned the original debt of $600 into one that should, by her calculations, stand at $183, not $412. There was a $229 discrepancy that Nathaniel Crow was going to have to explain. She was still staring at those numbers when Elias knocked on her door. She let him in. He had changed his shirt, clean blue cotton collar, buttoned hat in his hands. He looked around her kitchen with the deliberate, unseeing way he always had inside her house, the way of a man who was careful about where he let his eyes rest. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She pushed the ledger across the table to him and pointed to the final column without saying anything. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her. "He's been padding the balance," he said. "Not just padding. He turned down my last 2 payments. If he rejected the payments and then added penalty charges for non-payment." She traced the line with her finger. "He manufactured a default. He made the debt grow on paper while refusing to let me shrink it in practice." Elias was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" "I've suspected since October. I didn't know for certain until I sat down this morning with the notice and the ledger side by side." She closed the book. "He chose today because the wheat is 2 weeks from harvest. If he takes the land now, he takes the crop too. A full harvest, Elias. The best yield I've had in 3 years. And he knows it." Elias set his hat on the table. He ran one hand through his gray hair. He looked like a man who was adding up a sum he did not like the total of. "He's done this before," Elias said. "To the Harmon family 2 years ago. They lost their South 40 to him, and everyone in town called it bad luck." "It wasn't bad luck," Clara said. "No," Elias said. It wasn't. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the wheat field, that dry, papery sound that Clara loved, the sound of something alive and growing. She had listened to that sound for 3 years and promised herself she would listen to it for 30 more. "There's something else," Elias said. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. "I found this last month when I was checking the irrigation ditch on the north boundary, the one that feeds your east field." Clara unfolded it. It was a rough map, hand-drawn, showing the path of the irrigation channel, and a notation in pencil, someone else's handwriting, marking a point where the channel had been deliberately redirected. "That's on the township easement," Elias said. "The diversion was put in upstream of your intake. Your east field has been getting maybe a third of the water it should have had since last summer." Clara looked at the map. She looked at Elias. "The drought last year wasn't just drought," he said. "I talked to the man who digs the ditches for the county. He told me he was paid to redirect that channel, paid in cash, not on record. He would not tell me who paid him, but he told me when. March of last year, right after Crow turned down your October payment for the first time." Clara set the map down on the table next to the ledger. She looked at the two pieces of paper side by side, the record of a debt that had been deliberately inflated and the record of a water supply that had been deliberately stolen. Together, they were the shape of something that had been planned, not stumbled into. Someone had decided a year ago or more that Clara Whitfield's land was worth taking, and had set about manufacturing the conditions that would allow them to take it. "He's going to stand in front of the whole town today," Clara said, "and call it a legal debt collection." "Yes," Elias said, "and most of them are going to believe him." "Some of them," Elias said. "Not all." She looked at him. "Who's going to believe us?" He picked up his hat. "Let's go find out." They rode into Millhaven at 2:30 in the afternoon, Clara on her roan mare and Elias on the big gray he used for ranch work. The main street was the usual afternoon collection, women moving between the general store and the dry goods men gathered in front of the feed store, a wagon being loaded outside the hardware. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of ordinary that goes on and on until it doesn't. The word had gotten there before them somehow. Clara noticed it in the way people turned to look, the way conversations paused mid-sentence. She had grown up in this county. She had lived in this town her whole life. She knew what it meant when people looked at you like they were waiting to see what you were going to do. Victor Crow was standing in front of the bank when they rode up. He was 24 years old, well-dressed in the way of men who have never had to think about what things cost, with the kind of easy good looks that get taken for character by people who don't look closely enough. He watched Clara dismount with an expression that was almost sympathetic, the expression of a man who has already decided the outcome and is practicing being gracious about it. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I'm glad you came. My father hoped to speak with you personally before—" "Where is your father?" Clara said. Victor smiled. "He's inside, but perhaps we could—" "I'll speak with him inside then," Clara said, and walked past Victor Crow and through the door of the bank without waiting for an invitation. Victor looked at Elias. Elias looked back at him for exactly 1 second, the way a man looks at a thing he has measured and found smaller than it believed itself to be. Then Elias followed Clara inside. Nathaniel Crow was standing behind the counter. He was a man of 60, heavy-set, with white hair combed with visible precision, and the kind of face that had learned to look reasonable while thinking unreasonable things. He spread his hands in a gesture of welcome that did not reach his eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I'm sorry it's come to this." "No, you're not," Clara said. She placed her ledger on the counter. She placed the map beside it. "But you're going to be." Crow looked at the ledger. He looked at the map. He looked at Elias standing 1 step behind Clara's left shoulder, hat in hand, watching Crow with that still dark-eyed steadiness that had a quality to it, not threat exactly, but a kind of patient certainty that was in some ways more unnerving than anger. "Mr. Mercer," Crow said carefully, "this is a private banking matter." "Then stop making it public," Elias said. "You've already told half the town about her debt. I'd say the privacy left the building some time ago." Crow's jaw tightened. He looked back at Clara. "Mrs. Whitfield, the terms of your loan are clear." "Show me," Clara said. "Show me on this ledger where my calculation is wrong. Show me which payment you received that I haven't recorded. Show me the receipt for October or December or February. I'll wait while you look for it, Mr. Crow, because I don't believe you have one." The bank was very quiet. Through the window, Clara could see people stopping on the street outside. Victor Crow had come in behind them and was standing near the door with his pleasant expression going uncertain at the edges. Nathaniel Crow said nothing. "And when you're done not showing me the receipts," Clara continued, her voice carrying the steady, unhurried weight of a woman who has been waiting a long time to say true things out loud. "I'd like you to explain this map to the judge. The one that shows where your man redirected my irrigation channel last March. The same month you stopped accepting my payments. I believe that's called fraud, Mr. Crow. I believe that's called fraud in two separate directions at the same time, and I believe there are people in this town who are going to want to know about it." Nathaniel Crow looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Elias. Something moved behind his careful, reasonable face. Something that was calculation, not conscience, but calculation, arriving at a conclusion he hadn't expected to reach. "This is not the place," he started. "Town Hall," Clara said. "Today, 5 o'clock. You want the whole town to watch you take my land, Mr. Crow? Then the whole town is going to watch me show them what you did to take it." She picked up the ledger. She picked up the map. She walked to the door, and Elias held it open for her, and they walked out together into the hard Colorado afternoon sun. Victor Crow watched them go. He turned to his father. "What do we do?" Nathaniel Crow stood very still for a long moment, looking at the door they had walked out of. Then he said quietly and with precision, "Get Rigby, and send someone to find the judge." Outside, Clara stood at the hitch post and let herself breathe for the first time since morning. Elias came to stand beside her, and they both looked at the street at the people who had slowed their errands, and their errands who were watching them, without quite being willing to be seen watching. "You know what's going to happen now," Elias said quietly. "Yes," Clara said. "He's going to do everything he can before 5 o'clock to make sure the town shows up on his side." "I know that. We've got 2.5 hours. "Then we'd better not waste them," Clara said. She tucked the ledger under her arm and turned to look at him. His hat was in his hands, his gray hair wind-pushed, and he looked, she thought not for the first time, like a man who had been quietly standing between things and harm for so long that he had almost forgotten he was doing it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not with suspicion, with something more like wondering. Elias looked at her. He looked like he was deciding how much of a true thing to say. He settled on a partial one. "Because you brought me bread when I didn't know how to feed myself anymore," he said. "And because I've been sitting on the wrong side of that fence line for too long." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Well, come on then. We've got a case to build and a town to convince." She started walking. He walked beside her. Behind them, the doors of the Crow Bank stayed closed, and inside 2 men began making plans that would unravel by nightfall, though they didn't know it yet. The wheat field back at Clara's homestead moved in the afternoon wind, patient and golden and alive, waiting for a harvest that no one was going to steal. Not today. They had 2.5 hours, and a town full of people who had already made up their minds. Clara knew Millhaven. She had grown up watching the way it worked, the way information moved through it, like water through a cracked pipe, fast and uncontrolled, and always finding the lowest point. By the time she and Elias reached the end of the main street, she could already feel it happening. A woman outside the dress shop turned away too quickly. 2 men in front of the feed store stopped talking the moment she came within earshot. A boy of about 12 sitting on the steps of the general store watched her with the wide, unguarded curiosity of someone who had already heard something interesting about her from the adults in his life. Crow had been busy. She had not even reached the bank steps before he had started. "We need witnesses," Clara said. She kept her voice low and her face forward, and her pace steady. People who can speak to what they've seen. Pete Halley, Elias said immediately. He digs county ditches. He's the one who told me about the channel diversion. Will he say it in public? Elias was quiet for half a step. I think he might, if he understands what's at stake. Then let's go find him. Pete Halley was not hard to find. He was where he usually was in the afternoon at the far end of the lumber yard, eating his midday meal late, because he always forgot about it until the work reminded him he was hungry. He was a small, sun-darkened man of about 50, with the kind of permanent squint that came from spending decades looking into distance and sunlight. He looked up when Clara and Elias appeared, and something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly, but the expression of a man who had been waiting for a conversation he didn't want to have. "Mr. Halley," Clara said. She did not sit. She stood in front of him and looked at him directly because she had learned a long time ago that men like Pete Halley responded to directness the way skittish horses responded to a steady hand. "I need you to tell me the truth about the irrigation ditch." Pete looked at Elias. "You told her." "I showed her the map," Elias said. Pete set down his tin cup. He looked at the ground. He looked at Clara. "Mrs. Whitfield, I got a family." "So do I," Clara said. "I don't have children, but I have land that my father broke his back to build, and a husband buried in its soil, and 3 years of honest work that is about to be taken from me by a man who paid someone to steal my water, and then called it drought." She paused. "I'm not asking you to fight anyone. I'm asking you to tell the truth at the town hall at 5 o'clock, in front of people who deserve to know what was done." Pete was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his cup again, put it down again without drinking from it. "He paid me $30, Pete said. Cash. Told me it was a county drainage project. I didn't ask questions because $30 is $30, and I had a sick kid that winter." He finally looked up. "I knew it wasn't right. I knew when I saw where the diversion went that it wasn't right. But I told myself it was above me to figure out whose problem it was." "It was my problem," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am," Pete said. "I know that now." "Will you say it today? At 5 o'clock? Another silence. Pete Halley looked like a man being asked to step off a ledge and being told the ground was closer than it looked. "If I say it," he said, "Crow won't hire me again. He's got 3 county contracts." "If you don't say it," Elias said quietly, "Clara loses everything she has. And Crow keeps those contracts and uses them to do this to someone else next year." Pete looked at Elias for a long moment. Something passed between the two men that didn't need words, the recognition of one working man by another, the particular understanding of what it cost to do the right thing when the right thing had a price. 5 o'clock, Pete said finally. "I'll be there." Clara breathed. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Pete said. "Crow's going to call me a liar." "Let him," Clara said. "I've got a ledger that tells the same story you do." They were back on the street before the words had finished settling moving again because 2.5 hours was already becoming 2 hours, and there was still so much ground to cover. The next stop was Margaret Fenn, who ran the boarding house on the north end of town, and had been keeping careful records of her own for 20 years. The kind of records that small business owners keep when they live in a town with a dishonest banker and have learned to trust paper over memory. Margaret had not been defrauded by Crow. She was too careful and too sharp, and he knew it. But she had watched what he did to others, and she had written it down. She opened her door before Clara could knock, which meant she had seen them coming down the street, which meant she had been watching. "I heard about the notice," Margaret said. She was 60 stout, with white hair pinned severely and eyes that missed nothing. "Come in." Inside her parlor over coffee that Clara drank gratefully because she had not eaten since before dawn, Margaret Fenn spread out 3 years of handwritten observations. Not legal documents, not testimony exactly, but dates, names, amounts a record of conversations she had overheard of neighbors who had mentioned their banking troubles in passing of patterns that looked accidental until you put them side by side. "The Harmon family," Margaret said, tapping one page. lost their South 40 in 1880. Martin Harmon told me 6 months before that Crow had rejected 2 of his payments, and he couldn't understand why. He thought he'd made a mistake in his own records. She looked at Clara. Sound familiar? Word for word, Clara said. And the Pells the year before that. And Tom Bridger, though he just sold out and left before it got to a court. Margaret closed the folder and looked at Clara with the steady, unsentimental gaze of a woman who had been watching the world be unfair for long enough that it no longer surprised her, only angered her. He has a pattern, Clara. He picks people who are vulnerable widows, recent arrivals, families with sick members or bad seasons. People who are already struggling. And he waits until they're close enough to the end to panic, and then he manufactures the final step. Will you come to the town hall? Clara asked. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to call a meeting, Margaret said. Try to stop me. They left the boarding house with 15 minutes less time, and something Clara hadn't expected to feel hope. Dangerous, premature, and completely unwelcome, but there. It was on the walk back toward the center of town that Victor Crow found them. He came from the side street between the hardware store and the apothecary, moving with the particular kind of casual speed that means a person has been waiting and is trying not to look like it. He was alone, which surprised Clara, and he was not wearing his pleasant expression anymore. Mrs. Whitfield, he said. A word. Clara stopped. Elias stopped beside her. Victor looked at Elias. Privately, if you don't mind. I do mind, Clara said. Say what you came to say. Victor's jaw worked for a moment. He was not comfortable with this, she could see that. He was a man accustomed to conversations going the way he had rehearsed them, and Clara was not cooperating with his rehearsal. My father is willing to renegotiate, Victor said. The debt. He's willing to extend the terms another year, lower monthly payments. You could keep the property. Clara looked at him. In exchange for what? Victor hesitated for exactly 1 second too long. In exchange for not bringing whatever you think you have to the town hall today, he said. He's not asking you to drop it permanently. Just give it time. Let cooler heads prevail. Cooler heads? Clara repeated. It would be better for everyone. Victor. Clara's voice was quiet and entirely without heat. Your father diverted my water. He manufactured a default on a debt I was paying honestly. He has done this to at least 3 other families before mine, and you are standing here asking me to accept a slightly smaller version of the thing he has been doing to me for a year in exchange for my silence. She paused. Which part of that is the better offer? Victor looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, something that might in a different man have been shame. Mrs. Whitfield, my father has a great deal of influence in this county. I know that, Clara said. And you have a ledger and a ditch digger. And the truth, Clara said, which has a way of being louder than influence if you say it clearly enough in the right room. Victor looked at Elias. You're not helping her, he said. You're going to make it worse. If she goes in there today and can't prove everything she's claiming, Crow will have grounds to push forward immediately, no extensions, no negotiation. She'll lose everything by morning. She knows the risk, Elias said. Do you? Victor's voice shifted, not threatening exactly, but with an edge to it. Do you know what my father can do to your operation, Mr. Mercer? You've got a mortgage of your own. You've got a cattle contract through the county that runs through Crow's approval. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Clara looked at Elias. Elias looked at Victor Crow for a long moment, with that steady, measuring quietness. Then he said, I appreciate you reminding me what I've got to lose, but I notice you didn't say anything about what Clara's got to lose, which tells me everything I need to know about which side of this you're on. Victor opened his mouth, closed it, looked between them. 5 o'clock, Clara said. You'll want to be there. They walked past him, and he did not follow, and Clara did not look back, because looking back was a thing she had decided she could not afford today. But her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her ledger and kept walking. He wasn't wrong, she said quietly when they were out of earshot. About which part? About your contract, your mortgage. She looked straight ahead. Elias, if this goes wrong today, if Crow decides to come after you because of what you've done this afternoon, I need you to know that I never intended. Clara. His voice was patient and a little bit tired and completely firm. Stop. I mean it. I don't want... I know what you don't want, he said. And I know what you do want. You want your land and your wheat and the right to run your own life without asking anyone's permission. And those are the right things to want, and you shouldn't have to be apologizing to me for wanting them while we're in the middle of trying to get them for you. She was quiet. I've been careful my whole life, Elias said. He said it the way a man says something he has been thinking about for a long time without saying. I've been careful and practical, and I've never stuck my neck out past what was sensible. And I've been sitting on that porch for 3 years watching the world go by and telling myself that was wisdom. He paused. I don't think it was wisdom anymore. I think it was just the habit of a man who decided he didn't matter enough to risk anything. Clara looked at him. You matter, she said. I know that, Elias said. I'm just starting to act like it. They had 40 minutes left when they walked back into the center of Millhaven, and the center of Millhaven was not the same as it had been when they left it. Word had moved fast and pooled in every corner the way it always did. Clara could feel the town watching them, not hostile, not friendly, but that particular watching of people who have been told 2 different versions of a story and haven't decided which one they believe yet. That uncertainty was everything. That uncertainty was the only opening she had. Elias stopped in front of the feed store where 4 men were standing in a loose cluster. Ranchers, 2 of them, and a farmer named Caleb Ward, who had the property bordering Clara's on the east. Clara knew Caleb Ward. She had borrowed his wagon twice in 3 years and returned it with a loaf of bread and a quart of preserves each time, because that was how you maintained a neighborly relationship when you were a widow who needed occasional help with heavy lifting. Caleb, Elias said. Caleb Ward turned. He was a big, slow-moving man of about 55, with a beard that had given up on any particular shape. He looked at Clara with an expression that was several things at once: sympathy, discomfort, and the slightly pained look of a man who would prefer not to be asked to do anything difficult. Heard about your notice, he said to Clara. Did you hear about my ledger? Clara asked. Or the irrigation ditch? Caleb frowned. What about the ditch? So she told him. Right there in front of the feed store, in front of the other 3 men who had stopped pretending not to listen. She told him about the diversion. She told him about the rejected payments. She told it plainly and quickly, without drama, because the facts themselves were dramatic enough, and adding emotion to them would give men like Caleb Ward an excuse to call it hysteria. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My Eastfield's been running dry. Clara looked at him. Where does your intake sit relative to the diversion point? Caleb's eyes went very still. Below it, he said slowly. About 300 yards below it. The man to Caleb's left, a rancher named George Tripp, who Clara knew mostly by reputation, said, My intake's below there too. I figured it was the drought. It's not just the drought, Clara said. Another silence. A different quality to it this time. The silence of men doing arithmetic they hadn't expected to do, and arriving at an answer that made them angry. You said Pete Halley's coming tonight, Caleb said. He said he'd be there. Caleb looked at George Tripp. George Tripp looked at the 2 men beside him. Something passed around that circle that Clara couldn't quite hear, but could absolutely feel a kind of reckoning, a shift in the ground. I've got a beef with Crow about a loan term from last spring, George Tripp said. Not loudly, but clearly. I might come down to listen. Might as well, Caleb said. Ain't like I got anything better to do at 5 o'clock. Clara looked at Elias. He looked back at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. 30 minutes. They had 30 minutes and the town was beginning slowly. Reluctantly, the way a herd animal changes direction one at a time, and then all at once to turn. Inside the Crow bank, through the glass of the front window, Clara could see Nathaniel Crow standing with Rigby and 2 other men she didn't recognize. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Caleb Ward's group with the expression of a man watching a calculation he was sure of suddenly become uncertain. Good, Clara thought. Let him watch. She had 20 minutes to get to the town hall, lay out her evidence on a table, and arrange it in the order that told the truest story. She had Pete Halley and Margaret Fenn and Caleb Ward and George Tripp and possibly others she didn't know about yet. She had a ledger with 3 years of honest record-keeping in her own handwriting and a map that showed exactly where the water had gone and when. What she did not have was the judge. "Where's Hendricks?" she asked Elias. "Judge Hendricks." Elias's face did something complicated. "His brother is on Crow's payroll. You said that yourself." "I know, but is he an honest man underneath that?" Elias thought about it. "He's not dishonest," he said finally. "He's comfortable. There's a difference." "Can comfort be overcome by evidence?" "Sometimes," Elias said, "when the evidence is embarrassing enough to ignore." "Then let's make it embarrassing enough," Clara said. They walked into the town hall with 18 minutes to spare, and what they found there stopped them both cold in the doorway. The hall was already full, not full, the way it got for elections or announcements. Those were slow-building crowds, people arriving in 2s and 3s, with the unhurried energy of people coming to a scheduled event. This was a different kind of full. This was people who had heard something and came fast, chairs scraping, and voices low, and the particular tension of a room that is already picked aside before the meeting has started. Clara scanned the faces and felt her stomach drop. Most of the front rows were Crow's people. Men who owed him favors. Business owners who needed his goodwill. The town pastor whose church had received a generous anonymous donation the year before. Victor Crow sat in the front row. His pleasant expression restored his posture, the posture of a man on the correct side of history. Nathaniel Crow stood at the front of the room with the county land agent and a lawyer whose name Clara didn't know, but whose briefcase was expensive. He had used the same 30 minutes she had used. He had used them differently, and by all appearances, more effectively. "Mrs. Whitfield." Crow's voice filled the room like smoke fills a room quietly, and from every direction at once. "I'm glad you came. I had hoped this could be settled privately, but—" He spread his hands in that reasonable gesture. "Since you've chosen a public forum." "You chose it," Clara said, "the moment you sent men to my gate with papers." A murmur through the room. Not agreement, just movement, the crowd shifting to attention. Clara walked to the table that had been set up at the front and set her ledger down on it. She set the map beside it. She was aware of every eye in the room on her back, and she kept her spine straight and her hands steady, and reminded herself that the truth did not need her to be anything other than clear. "This ledger," she said, turning to face the room, "contains every payment I have made to the Crow Bank over 3 years. 27 payments. I have the dates, the amounts, and the running balance." She opened it to the final page. "By my records, I owe $183. Mr. Crow's notice claims I owe $412. I would like him to explain in front of this room where the $229 difference comes from." The room was very quiet. Nathaniel Crow opened his mouth, and then the door of the town hall opened and Pete Halley walked in. He was still in his work clothes. He had not changed, had not cleaned up, had simply come directly from the lumber yard with his lunch pail still in his hand, and the look of a man who had made a decision and was not going to unmake it between the lumber yard and the town hall door. He walked up the center aisle without looking at Crow, without looking at anyone except Clara, and he set his lunch pail on the table beside her ledger, like he was setting down the heaviest thing he had ever carried. "I'll tell you where some of it comes from," Pete Halley said to the room. "It comes from my work, and I'm sorry for it." Nathaniel Crow's face went very still. Behind Crow, Rigby took one step forward, and then stopped, because Elias Mercer had moved from the wall where he had been standing to a position directly between Rigby and the front table, and Elias was not a small man, and he was not moving. And then Margaret Fenn walked through the door with her folder, and Caleb Ward came in behind her, and George Tripp after him. And the room that had belonged to Nathaniel Crow 30 minutes ago was suddenly, irrevocably, something else entirely. Clara looked at all of them. She looked at the room. She looked at the ledger on the table and the map beside it, and the people who had come, not because she had asked them to fight, not because she had offered them anything, but because the truth, when it is told plainly enough and in front of enough people, has a gravity of its own. She thought about Thomas buried in the soil of the field she was fighting for. She thought about her father's hands, building the first wall of the house she still lived in. She thought about 40 acres of wheat moving in the afternoon wind, patient and golden waiting. She picked up her ledger. She said, "Let's begin." Clara said, "Let's begin." And the room answered with silence so complete she could hear the lamp oil burning. She had been in this town hall before for elections for drought relief meetings for the winter collection drive that Margaret Fenn organized every November. She knew the smell of it, the particular way sound moved through it, the way the floorboards creaked near the back left corner, where the foundation had settled wrong. She had always been a member of the audience in this room, a widow in the third row, quiet and useful and ignored. Not today. She opened the ledger to the first page and held it up so the room could see the columns. Her handwriting was clear and even. She had learned it from her father, who believed that a person's records were a reflection of their character and that sloppy numbers meant sloppy thinking. 3 years, she said. 27 payments. I will read every one of them if this room has the patience for it. But I will start with the last two, the ones Mr. Crow refused to accept. Nathaniel Crow had moved to stand beside his lawyer. The lawyer was a man named Aldrich, brought in from Denver by the look of his boots and the cut of his coat, and he was writing something on a notepad with the focused expression of a man preparing to earn his fee. October 14th, 1881, Clara said. $14.30. Tendered at the bank window to Denton Marsh. Refused and returned with the notation, and I am reading Mr. Marsh's own words here. Insufficient to satisfy current terms. December 2nd, 1881. $16 even. Same result. Same notation. She closed the ledger. Mr. Crow, what changed in the terms between September 1881 and October 1881 that made payments I had been making without objection for 2 full years suddenly insufficient? Crow's lawyer stepped forward before Crow could speak. Mrs. Whitfield, the bank reserves the right to reassess loan terms in accordance with— I did not ask you, Clara said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. I asked Mr. Crow. Another murmur through the room. Louder this time. Clara felt it the way you feel a current in a river, not visible, but absolutely real, moving underneath everything. Crow cleared his throat. The terms of the loan allow for adjustment when the underlying collateral is deemed to have changed in assessed value. My land did not change in value, Clara said. The drought reduced my yield. It did not reduce my acreage. My deed hasn't changed by a single acre. So I'll ask again what changed in October. Crow said nothing. His lawyer wrote faster. Judge Hendricks was sitting to the left of the main table in the chair that had been placed there to give the proceedings something resembling official standing. He was a compact man of about 65, gray-bearded, with the habitual expression of someone who would prefer everyone to calm down. He had been watching Clara with the careful attention of a man who had come in expecting a simple debt collection, and was rapidly revising his understanding of the situation. Mr. Crow, Hendricks said, and his voice had a quality to it that Crow's lawyer heard, and Clara heard, and Crow himself heard, the quality of a man who was comfortable being asked to hold people in contempt, and was now considering whether he might need to use it. The question seemed straightforward. Please answer it. The room held its breath. Crow said, I would need to review the specific records. I have the records, Clara said, right here. What I don't have is your explanation for why the balance I owe is $229 higher than the balance my records show. And I don't have your explanation for why my water was stolen. She picked up the map and walked it to Judge Hendricks, directly laying it on the arm of his chair. She did not ask permission. She did not wait for an invitation. She simply placed it where he could see it and said, That is a map of the county irrigation channel that feeds my east field. The mark at the top is where the diversion was installed. Mr. Halley will tell you when it was installed and who paid him to do it. Pete Halley was standing at the side of the room with his lunch pail still in his hand. He looked like a man at the edge of a cliff who had already made the decision to jump and was just waiting for the ground to stop moving. "Mr. Halley," Judge Hendricks said. Pete stepped forward. His voice was rough and direct, a man who was not accustomed to public speaking and had decided to compensate by not pretending to be. "March of last year," he said. "I was paid $30 in cash to redirect the north tributary of the county irrigation channel. The man who paid me was Denton Marsh. He said it was a county drainage project." Pete paused. He looked at Marsh, who was standing near the back wall with the expression of a man who wished the wall would open and accept him. "It was not a county project. There was no paperwork. There was no county seal on any document. I took the money because I needed it, and I told myself I didn't need to understand what I was doing." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I understood what I was doing." The room erupted. Not in shouting, it was too stunned for shouting. It was the eruption of 24 people all turning to the person next to them at the same moment, a wave of urgent whispered consultation that made the room sound like a creek after heavy rain. Denton Marsh's face had gone the color of old chalk. Crow's lawyer stopped writing and said something close to Crow's ear. Crow shook his head once sharp and tight. Caleb Ward stood up from his chair in the second row without being asked. "I got a question," he said with the blunt assurance of a man who had been farming long enough to know that his time had value and he was not going to waste it on ceremony. "My east field intake is downstream from that diversion. I've had 3 dry seasons in a row, and I put it down to weather. Are you telling me some of that was Crow's ditch work?" Pete Halley looked at Caleb. "Yes, sir, I'd say so." "My intake too," George Tripp said from 3 seats over. He was not asking. He was confirming something he had already calculated on the walk from the feed store. Crow said loudly, cutting across the noise, "This is speculation and hearsay, and I will not stand here and allow a disgruntled laborer and a woman with a grudge to—" "A woman with a ledger," Clara said, clearly, into the exact moment of silence that followed Crow's voice. "A woman with a ledger, a map, 3 years of documented payments, and a room full of your other customers who are starting to ask very similar questions about their own accounts." That landed. Clara watched it land. She watched Crow's face absorb it and rearrange itself and come back with something harder, something less reasonable, something closer to the actual thing underneath. "Your debt is valid," Crow said. "Whatever else you want to claim about ditches and water, your debt is valid, and it is due today, and the terms of this proceeding don't change that." Judge Hendricks looked up from the map. "The terms of this proceeding, Mr. Crow, are currently under my discretion, and I am not yet satisfied that I understand the full nature of this debt." A beat. One of those beats that a room remembers. Crow turned to Hendricks with the careful, controlled expression of a man who had bought a great deal of goodwill over many years and was now presenting the bill. "Your Honor," he said with a smoothness that cost him something, "I've been a contributor to the stability of this county for 30 years. My bank has financed more homes, more businesses, more livelihoods in Millhaven than any other single institution. I think the court owes the Crow Bank a measure of good faith," Hendricks said flatly. "And I will extend it to you and to Mrs. Whitfield equally. Which means I need to hear from both sides before I rule on anything." He picked up the map. "Mr. Aldrich, does your client have documentation showing the basis for the current assessed debt?" Aldrich straightened. "We have the original loan documents." "I have those too," Clara said. She produced them from inside the ledger, the original agreement folded and refolded until the creases were soft pulled out and smoothed flat on the table. "I've read them 40 times. Show me the clause that permitted the interest adjustment in October 1881. Aldrich took the document from his own briefcase. He opened it. He read. Clara watched him read and watched the almost invisible shift in his expression when he found, or rather did not find, what he was looking for. "There is a general clause," he said carefully, Regarding the bank's right to read it out loud, Clara said. Aldrich looked at her. He looked at Crow. He looked at Judge Hendricks. He read it. It said that the bank reserved the right to call the full loan balance due in the event of default. It did not say the bank could redefine what constituted default. It did not say the bank could reject payments already tendered and then charge penalties for non-payment. The room heard the difference, even if half the people in it couldn't have articulated it in legal terms. Clara could see it on their faces the moment when an argument that had sounded technical and complicated revealed itself to be simple, the moment when the bank says she owes more than she paid became the bank is lying. Crow knew the room had heard it. She could tell because he stopped waiting for the process to work in his favor and started working against it instead. "Victor," he said. Victor Crow stood up from the front row. He walked to the table with the same fluid ease. He always had the ease of a young man who had never needed to brace himself against anything. He stood beside his father, and he looked at Clara, and the pleasant expression was gone completely, now replaced by something simpler and more honest, which was the expression of someone who had been told all his life that he would win and was now being forced to reckon with the possibility that he might not. "Mrs. Whitfield," Victor said, "I want to speak plainly." "That would be a refreshing change," Clara said. Something moved through the crowd, not quite laughter, but adjacent to it. Victor's jaw tightened. "You are a widow," he said. "You are managing a property that by any objective measure is beyond the capacity of a single woman to sustain without—" "Victor." Elias's voice came from the side of the room. Quiet. Absolute. Victor turned. Elias had been standing at the wall since they came in hat in hand, and he had been watching without moving, the way a man watches something he is deciding about. Now he stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has calculated the distance and knows exactly how far he needs to go. "Don't," Elias said. "Don't do that." Victor looked at him. "Mr. Mercer, this doesn't. Her crop yield from last year," Elias said, before the diversion was installed, was 42 bushels per acre on 20 acres. That's 840 bushels. At market price last September, that's $378 gross. Her operating costs by her own records run about $90 a season. That's $288 clear. He paused. More than enough to retire the remaining debt in a single season. The remaining debt is calculated by her ledger, not yours. The only reason she's standing here today, instead of paying off the last of the note, is that someone stole her water. The room was very, very still. Victor said carefully, "That's a calculation based on hypothetical. It's a calculation based on her ledger and market prices and the county water records," Elias said. "Which I looked at this morning. The county records show the main tributary flow dropped by 31% downstream of the diversion point. That's on file. It's public record. Anyone in this room can check it." Clara looked at Elias. He had not told her about the county water records. He had gone and found them on his own sometime between agreeing to come with her and showing up at her door in his clean shirt, and he had not mentioned it because he was not the kind of man who announced what he was doing before he had done it. She felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for yet and did not have time to examine. Crow's lawyer leaned close to Crow and said something very fast and very quiet. Crow shook his head. Aldrich said it again. Crow's expression hardened. "Your Honor," Aldrich said, turning to Hendricks with the sudden pivot of a man changing tack. "My client is prepared to offer a settlement, the debt reduced to the amount shown in Mrs. Whitfield's ledger, plus a modest administrative fee." "No," Clara said. Aldrich blinked. "I beg your pardon. No settlement," Clara said. "I don't want a reduced debt. I want an invalidated one. What Mr. Crow did was not a billing error. He deliberately refused payments to manufacture a default. He diverted my water to ensure my yield would fall short. He has done this to other families in this county. A settlement with an administrative fee is not justice. It is a discount on theft." Dead silence. Then Margaret Fenn stood up from her seat in the middle of the room, her folder in her hands. "Your Honor," she said with the particular authority of a woman who has been managing difficult men for 60 years. I have records going back to 1878 showing a consistent pattern of loan manipulation by the Crow Bank against customers in financial distress. I would like to submit them for your review." Hendricks looked at Margaret. He looked at her folder. He looked at the room, at Caleb Ward and George Tripp still standing, at Pete Halley at the side wall, at the faces of people who had come in ready to watch a widow lose her farm and were now sitting with the dawning uncomfortable recognition that this was happening to more than one of them. He looked at Crow. And in that moment, Clara saw the calculation happen behind the judge's eyes. Not conscience. She wasn't fool enough to believe it was conscience. Calculation. The calculation of a man who understood that the ground had shifted and that the side he was standing on had become very rapidly the wrong one. "I'll review the documents," Hendricks said. "I am suspending the debt collection deadline pending that review." The room broke open. Not in celebration. Not yet too many people still uncertain, still watching Crow for his reaction, but in noise, in movement, in the sudden release of 2 hours of held tension. Clara stood at the table and gripped the edge of it with both hands and breathed. Crow was speaking to Aldrich. Victor was speaking to Crow. Rigby at the back of the room had the look of a man who had been counting on a conclusion that was no longer arriving. And then Crow did the thing that Clara had not anticipated. He turned to the room. He raised his voice. Not loud, he was too practiced for loud, but projected, shaped the voice of a man who had been controlling rooms for 30 years. "People of Millhaven," he said, "I understand that what you've heard today sounds alarming. I understand that accusations have been made that, if true, would be very serious indeed, but I want you to consider the source." He let that settle for a moment. A woman alone facing the natural consequences of 3 bad seasons looking for someone to blame. A rancher whose own finances are not without their complications. He glanced at Elias. And a day laborer who is paid to do work and now claims not to have understood it. He spread his hands. "Is this the foundation on which you want to overturn 30 years of banking in this county? The word of 3 people with 3 different reasons to want my name damaged." The room stirred. Not back to Crow's side, but stirring uncertain, the way crowds always stirred when someone articulate told them their instincts might be wrong. Clara felt it, and it was the worst feeling of the afternoon. Not fear, rage, because Crow was doing what powerful men always did when the facts turned against them. He was attacking the people holding the facts, and some part of the room was going to let him, because that was the habit of 30 years, the comfortable habit of believing the man who had always been believed. She was going to answer. She had her answer ready, calm, factual, pointed. She did not get to use it, because the door of the town hall opened one more time, and the man who walked through it was someone Clara had not expected, had not sought, had not even thought to look for. His name was Frank Ellison. He was 70 years old, had been a Millhaven resident since before Clara was born, and he had run the mill on the south end of town for 40 years before his son took it over. He was the oldest continuous property owner in the county. He was the man who had given the land for the original town hall. He had a voice that carried like a church bell without effort, and he used it now from the doorway before he had even fully entered the room. "I had a loan with Crow Bank in 1877, Frank Ellison said. Every head in the room turned. "I paid it off in 1879. I have records of every payment I made. And I have records of 3 payments that Crow's Bank marked as received that do not appear in my final settlement statement." He held up a bundle of papers that were old enough and worn enough to make it clear they had not been assembled this afternoon. "I've been sitting on these for 4 years because I didn't want the trouble. That woman standing up there is in that trouble right now, and I am done sitting." The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then 4. Then 5. Nathaniel Crow looked at Frank Ellison. Frank Ellison looked back at him with the absolute unhurried calm of a man who has been waiting 4 years to be in this exact room with this exact expression on his face. Crow turned to his lawyer. Aldrich had stopped writing. His pen was still in his hand, but it was not moving, and his face had the particular professional blankness of a man rapidly calculating whether this case was still worth what he was being paid. Judge Hendricks stood up. When a sitting judge stood up in a room, people noticed. The noise stopped. Everything stopped. "Mr. Crow," Hendricks said, "I am expanding the scope of my review, and I am requesting that Mr. Marsh—" He looked at Denton Marsh, still against the back wall, who had not moved or spoken since Pete Halley named him. "Remain available. Mr. Marsh, I'd advise against leaving town this evening." Marsh's throat moved. He nodded. Crow said very quietly to no one in particular, "This is not over." Clara heard it. She was the closest one to him, and she heard it, and she turned to look at him, and she said also quietly, so that only he could hear, "No, it isn't. But it's different now. And you know it." Crow looked at her. For just a moment, just one, the reasonable expression dropped completely, and what was underneath it was not anger, not contempt, but something smaller and more honest. Something that looked almost like recognition. The look of a man who had gambled on being the only one who kept records and had just discovered he was wrong. Then the expression came back, and he turned and walked toward the side door with Aldrich following and Victor 2 steps behind. Clara stood at the table. The room was noise and movement now. People standing, people talking. Frank Ellison making his way to Judge Hendricks with his bundle of papers. Pete Halley picked up his lunch pail. Margaret Fenn was already speaking to a woman Clara didn't know, gesturing at the folder in her hands. Elias came to stand beside her. She became aware suddenly that her knees were not entirely reliable. She had been holding herself rigid for 4 hours since the moment she had picked up that bread and started walking across the field, and something in her structure was announcing that it had done its job and was now presenting a bill. She gripped the edge of the table. "Easy," Elias said quietly. Not a command, not even a suggestion. Just the word offered the way you offer a hand to someone on a narrow path. "I'm fine," Clara said. "I know you are," he said. "I'm just standing here in case you want company." She looked at him. She had known this man for 11 months. She had sat on his porch and drunk his coffee and talked about wheat prices and drought and the long, slow business of surviving. She had known he was steady. She had not known until this afternoon quite what that steadiness was made of. "You went to the county records this morning," she said. "Before I changed my shirt," he said. She almost laughed. She felt it rise in her throat and become something else. Not a laugh exactly, not a cry, something in between that she pressed back down, because this was not the time and this was not the place. "We haven't won yet," she said. "No," Elias agreed. "We haven't." Outside the town hall, through the walls, she could hear the sound of the afternoon horses, voices, the ordinary noise of a town going about its business. The wheat field was 4 miles away, moving in the wind, patient and golden, waiting the way it had always waited. But there was something different in the quality of the waiting now. Something that had not been there this morning when she walked across it with a loaf of bread, and her jaw set hard and her eyes dry. She could not name it yet, but she felt it. Inside the room, Judge Hendricks was reading Frank Ellison's papers. Marsh had not moved from the wall. Pete Halley was talking to Caleb Ward in a low, serious voice. The town was doing what towns do when the story they believed turns out to be a different story. It was rearranging itself slowly and with discomfort around the new information, and Nathaniel Crow was gone through the side door, and the lawyer was gone after him, and the room that had belonged to them was now unmistakably something else. It was not over. Clara knew that. Crow was not a man who would accept a single afternoon's reversal without finding another angle, another pressure point, another way to make the world arrange itself to his advantage. He had done this too long and too successfully to fold, because a widow and a rancher and an old mill owner showed up with paperwork. But she had done something today that she had not been sure she could do. She had stood in this room and she had told the truth in front of people who had reasons to disbelieve her, and she had made enough of them hesitate. And sometimes hesitation was the first crack in a wall. And sometimes a first crack was all you needed. Judge Hendricks looked up from the papers and found Clara across the room. He held her gaze for a moment, that careful assessing gaze of a man revising his understanding, and gave a single small nod that said nothing specific and promised nothing outright, but meant unmistakably, "I am listening." Clara nodded back. Outside, the sun was going down over the Colorado mountains, painting everything in the particular gold and red of a frontier evening. The debt collection deadline had come and passed without a transfer of deed. Her land was still hers tonight. One night at a time. She picked up her ledger, picked up the map, and turned toward the door. She slept 4 hours that night, maybe 5. She was not sure because she stopped counting somewhere around 2 in the morning when she gave up on sleep entirely and sat at her kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and a candle burning low and the particular silence of a house that knows it is still standing but is not yet sure for how long. The judge had suspended the deadline. That was real. That had happened. But suspension was not dismissal, and Hendricks had not ruled on anything. And Nathaniel Crow had walked out of that town hall through the side door with his lawyer and his son, and the controlled expression of a man who had lost one round and was already thinking about the next one. Clara knew that expression. She had seen it on men like Crow her whole life. It was the expression that came right before they stopped being reasonable. She was at the barn before sunrise. She fed the horses, checked the smaller mare's leg. Better not good, but better, and walked the fence line of the east field, the way her father had taught her to do when something felt wrong. Because sometimes the land showed you things your mind was too busy to notice. The wheat was good. Tall enough now that it moved in waves when the pre-dawn wind came through, and she stood at the edge of it and put her hand out and let the stalks brush her palm, and told herself that this was real. This was hers, and no one was going to take it in the night. She was back inside making coffee when she heard the horse on the road. One horse, moving fast. She went to the window. It was Victor Crow. He came alone, which was different from yesterday, and he tied his horse at the gatepost himself, instead of waiting for someone to do it, which was also different. And he walked up the path to her door with his hat in his hands and his shoulders not quite squared, which was the most different thing of all. Clara opened the door before he knocked. Victor looked at her. He looked worse than he had yesterday, not disheveled, not undone, but with the specific tiredness of someone who had spent the night in a difficult conversation. She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway and waited. "My father has a plan," Victor said. No preamble, no pleasantries. "I think you should know about it." Clara kept her face still. "Why?" Victor looked down at his hat. He turned it in his hands twice, and then looked back up, and what was in his face was something she had not seen from him before. Not charm, not calculation, something younger and considerably less comfortable. "Because what he's planning is wrong," Victor said. "And I have spent most of my life telling myself that my father's business decisions were not my concern, and that made me—" He stopped. "It made me the same as him. And I don't want to be the same as him anymore." Clara studied him for a long moment. A man who had spent 24 years on the comfortable side of his father's operations was standing on her porch at sunrise, telling her he had decided to change. That was either the most important thing anyone had said to her in 2 days, or it was a trap so well constructed she couldn't see the edges of it. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll pour you coffee, and you'll tell me everything." What Victor told her over 2 cups of coffee at her kitchen table was this: Nathaniel Crow had spent the night making arrangements. Not in Millhaven. Millhaven had shifted too far, and he knew it. But Crow's operation was not limited to Millhaven. The bank held financing arrangements with a land company based in Denver, a company called Halcyon Land and Development, which had been quietly acquiring failed homestead properties throughout Jefferson County for 3 years. Every property Crow had taken through manufactured default, the Harmons, the Pells. Tom Bridger's place, the others had been sold within 6 months to Halcyon at prices significantly below market value. The arrangement was simple and dirty. Crow identified vulnerable properties, manufactured the conditions for default, took the land through the bank, and sold it to Halcyon for a percentage of the subsequent development profit. Halcyon wanted the land for a railroad right-of-way, the Denver and Pacific Line, that had been pushing its survey west for 2 years. Clara's 40 acres sat directly in the path of the proposed route. Her land was not worth $412 to Nathaniel Crow. It was worth considerably more than that to the Denver and Pacific Railroad. "He sent a wire to Denver last night," Victor said, "to the Halcyon office. He's asked them to send a representative to Millhaven. He believes if he can get a formal transfer of deed, even a contested one, even one under judicial review before Hendricks rules, he can present Halcyon with a fait accompli that will be harder to unwind than a suspended deadline. Clara sat with this. She sat with the full shape of it. Not just the immediate theft of her land, not just the manufactured debt, but the 3-year architecture of a scheme that had been designed from the beginning to funnel frontier homesteads into the hands of a railroad company that would pay Crow a percentage on every acre. "How many properties?" she said. "I don't know exactly. At least 8 that I know of, possibly more." "And you knew?" Victor's jaw tightened. "I suspected. I told myself I didn't know. There's a difference between those 2 things that I have been using to sleep at night for 2 years and—" He stopped. "And it's not enough of a difference. No, ma'am. I knew." Clara looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the ledger still open on the table from last night. She thought about 8 families, 8 properties, 8 sets of people who had done what she had done, worked honestly, kept records, made payments, and had lost their land to a scheme they never had the full picture of, because they were too busy trying to survive to see the architecture above them. "Why are you telling me this?" she said, not with suspicion anymore, with something more precise than suspicion. "If your father is sending for someone from Denver, and if that person arrives with enough money and enough lawyers, you are giving me the only warning that makes anything possible. That is not a small thing, Victor. That puts you on the wrong side of your father's business." "I know that," Victor said. "You'll lose your place in the bank." "Yes?" "He may not forgive it." "No," Victor said. "He won't." He looked up, and his face was steady, in the way faces go steady when a decision has been fully made and the making is finished. "I've spent 24 years being my father's son. I'd like to spend the next 24 being my own man, even if I have to start from nothing to do it." He paused. "My mother was a schoolteacher. She believed things were supposed to be done correctly. She died before she found out how her husband did his business. I've always thought that was a mercy." Another pause, shorter, harder. "I don't think it was a mercy anymore. I think the truth was her right, and she was cheated out of it, same as you." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and closed the ledger. "How long before the Halcyon man arrives?" "He'll take the morning train from Denver. That's—" Victor calculated. "He'll be in Millhaven by early afternoon." "Then I have 4 hours," Clara said. "And I need to send a wire." Victor blinked. "To whom?" "The Denver and Pacific Railroad Company offices," Clara said. "Not Halcyon, the railroad itself." She was already moving ledger under one arm map in hand, her good coat off the hook by the door. "Halcyon is a middleman. The railroad is the buyer. If the railroad knows that the properties they're purchasing were fraudulently obtained, they have a liability problem. Big companies don't like liability problems. They like clean titles." She looked at Victor. Who at the railroad would have the authority to stop a land acquisition? Victor stared at her. "How do you know about railroad land acquisition structures?" "My husband worked as a surveyor for 2 years before we married," Clara said. "He explained the whole system to me one winter when we had nothing but time and a fireplace." She pulled on her coat. "The name Victor." Victor said almost despite himself. "There's a man named Alderman Cole. He's the chief title officer for the Denver and Pacific. His job is to make sure every piece of land the railroad acquires has an uncontested deed. If there's a judicial review pending, if there's a fraud claim on record, he won't authorize the purchase. He can't. It would expose the entire line's title chain." "Where do I send the wire?" Victor gave her the address. She was out the door in 3 minutes. Elias was riding up the path as she came out, which meant he had started early too, which meant he had spent his night doing the same arithmetic she had done and arrived at the same conclusion that morning was going to matter more than yesterday's afternoon. He saw Victor Crow's horse at the gate and stopped. "Victor came to warn me," Clara said before he could ask. She was walking fast. "Crow's bringing someone from Denver, Railroad Land Company. I'll explain everything on the way to the telegraph office, but we have to go now." Elias looked at Victor, who had come to stand in the doorway. Something passed between them, not the measuring look of yesterday, but something more complicated, more provisional. The look of a man revising a judgment about another man based on new information. "Can you ride?" Elias said to Victor. Victor blinked. "Yes." "Then come with us. If Crow's man finds out you warned her before we get that wire sent, you don't want to be sitting at her kitchen table alone." Victor untied his horse. The three of them rode into Millhaven together, and Clara thought not for the first time that the frontier had a way of assembling unexpected alliances, that the person you most needed was sometimes the last person you would have thought to ask, and that pride was a luxury that people with something real to lose could not always afford. The telegraph office was run by a man named Simmons, who opened at 7, and who was. Clara knew a man who prided himself on his neutrality in town disputes. He transmitted what he was paid to transmit, without editorial comment, and kept confidential what was meant to be confidential. He looked at the three of them when they came through his door with the measured blankness of a professional who had seen surprising combinations of people before and had learned not to react to them. Clara wrote the wire out by hand, concise and specific, the way her father had taught her to write anything that needed to actually be read. She addressed it to Alderman Cole, Chief Title Officer, Denver, and Pacific Railroad. She stated that she was the current legal owner of a 40-acre property in Jefferson County, Colorado, that she believed had been identified as part of a proposed Denver and Pacific right-of-way acquisition. She stated that the property was currently the subject of a judicial review in Millhaven Township regarding fraudulent debt manipulation by the Crow Bank. She stated that a representative of Halcyon Land and Development was traveling to Millhaven that day with the apparent intent of taking possession of a deed that was under judicial suspension. She requested that Mr. Cole contact Judge Hendricks in Millhaven before authorizing any purchase, and that he be advised that the title chain for at least 8 properties in the proposed acquisition corridor was potentially compromised by the same fraud. She signed it with her full name, her property description, and the case reference number that Hendricks had given her the night before when he suspended the deadline. She slid it across to Simmons with the transmission fee. Simmons read it without expression, confirmed the address, and began transmitting. Clara stood at the counter and watched the machine and reminded herself to breathe. Victor was by the window. Elias was near the door. Neither of them spoke. The telegraph machine clicked and clicked and clicked, and outside, the morning was getting brighter, and the town was waking up. And somewhere in Denver, a train was pulling out of the station with a man on it who did not yet know that the transaction he was traveling to close had developed complications. "It's sent," Simmons said. Clara exhaled. "Thank you." "Don't know what you sent," Simmons said with professional precision. "Don't ask. Don't comment." "Appreciated," Clara said. She turned. Elias was looking at her with the quiet, steady attention that she had come to understand over 11 months was his version of speaking. He was not a man who narrated his concern. He was a man who positioned himself between you and the direction the trouble was coming from, and let that say what it needed to say. "Now what?" Victor said. "Now we go see Judge Hendricks," Clara said. "Before your father does." Hendricks was at his office above the land registry, which was where he conducted official business before court hours. They found him at his desk, with Frank Ellison's papers spread in front of him, and a cup of cold coffee at his elbow that he had forgotten to drink, which told Clara he had also spent the night working. He looked up when they came in. He looked at Victor with an expression that was carefully professionally neutral. "Mr. Crow," he said. "Your Honor," Victor said, "I have information relevant to the review." Hendricks looked at Clara. Clara nodded. Hendricks gestured to the chairs. Victor told him everything he had told Clara, in the same flat, direct, undecorated way, the way a man tells the truth when he has decided to stop telling anything else. He told him about Halcyon Land and Development. He told him about the railroad right-of-way. He told him about the pattern of manufactured defaults and the Denver connection and the wire his father had sent the night before. Hendricks listened without interrupting. His pen was in his hand, but he did not write anything down. He was listening, the way judges listen when they have already written enough and need to think. When Victor finished, Hendricks was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Crow, You understand that what you've just described implicates your father in a scheme that goes significantly beyond a disputed debt collection. Yes, sir, Victor said. You understand that your testimony on these matters may be required, and that your father will have full knowledge of what you've said here. Yes, sir. And you're prepared for those consequences. Victor looked at his hands. Then he looked at Hendricks. I am, he said. I've been prepared since this morning when I made the decision. The preparation doesn't make it easier, but it's right. Something shifted in Hendricks's expression, the careful neutrality giving way just slightly to something that might have been respect. He turned to Clara. The wire to Cole, when did you send it? 20 minutes ago. Good. He stood up. I am expanding my review order to include an examination of all Crow Bank loan records for the past 5 years. I am also issuing a hold on any deed transfer involving Crow Bank as a party until the review is concluded. He looked at Victor. And I am requesting that you remain available to this court. I will be, Victor said. Hendricks picked up his coat. I'd better get to the telegraph office myself, he said. If Cole is already on a train, his assistant will need to receive instruction. He paused at the door and looked at Clara. Mrs. Whitfield, your land is not going anywhere today. He left. The three of them sat in the empty office for a moment, in the particular silence that follows a thing being decided. Victor said, He's going to find out within the hour. Your father, Elias said. Yes. Victor stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at Clara, and his face was the face of someone who had set down a weight that had been reshaping them from the inside for years and was only now beginning to feel the difference. I'm sorry, he said, for what my father did, for what I allowed by not speaking sooner. I know, Clara said. She stood too. What will you do now? Victor looked at the door Hendricks had just walked through. I'm going to go find my father, he said, and I'm going to tell him what I've done, before someone else does. He paused. It's the last honest thing I can do in this situation. He deserves to hear it from me, not from a courthouse runner. He walked out. They listened to his boots on the stairs, and then the sound of him mounting his horse, and then silence. Elias looked at Clara. That was either courage or stupidity. Both, Clara said. Usually is with the important things. They were back on the street when it happened. Not gradually, not with warning, just the sudden absolute shock of the thing Clara had been told to expect, but had not fully expected until it was standing in front of her. Nathaniel Crow was coming down the main street on foot, and he was coming fast, and he was not alone. He had Rigby on one side, and two men Clara had never seen before on the other men, with the out-of-town look of hired muscle men whose presence in Millhaven had a specific and unpleasant meaning. Crow had not waited for the halcyon representative. He had decided to move before the morning got any older. He stopped when he saw Clara and Elias. His eyes went to them, calculated the situation in a single second, and went very hard. You sent a wire, he said, not a question. I sent several things, Clara said. To Cole. Crow's voice was controlled, but only just. You sent a wire to Alderman Cole at Denver and Pacific. Simmons keeps confidential. He stopped. He had been talking to Simmons this morning too, and Simmons had told him nothing, and the calculation had brought him here anyway. He was not a stupid man. That was what made him dangerous. What I sent is my business, Clara said. You have no idea what you've done, Crow said, and now there was something in his voice that was not the reasonable banker, not the community pillar, not any of the things he had practiced being. It was something rawer and more honest, and it was not a good honest. You have complicated a transaction that involves parties significantly larger than you or your 40 acres. Mrs. Whitfield and those parties are not going to be pleased. Then they should have built their railroad through land they purchased honestly, Clara said. Crow took one step forward. Rigby moved with him. Elias stepped forward, not beside Clara, in front of her. One step deliberate, and then he was between Rigby and Clara, with 4 feet of Millhaven Main Street separating them, and his hands were loose at his sides and his face was completely still. Rigby, Elias said. I've known you for 6 years. You're not a bad man. You're a man who does what he's paid to do, and I understand that. But I need you to think very carefully right now about what you're being paid to do and what it means this morning when there's a judicial hold on every deed Crow Bank holds and a judge who was in his office 30 minutes ago expanding a fraud investigation. Rigby looked at Elias. He looked at Crow. He looked at the two men beside him. Something worked in his face, the arithmetic of a man recalculating risk. Crow said, "Rigby." "I ain't getting arrested for you, Mr. Crow," Rigby said. His voice was flat. "I didn't sign on for that." He looked at the two strangers. "I don't know what you told them you were bringing them here for, but I'm done." He stepped back, one step, then two. The two strangers looked at each other. One of them said quietly to the other, "Nobody said anything about a judge." They were gone before Crow could respond. Not running, walking with the deliberate speed of men who had correctly identified a situation that was no longer worth their per diem. Crow stood alone on the main street of Millhaven, with his hands at his sides, and the morning growing brighter around him, and the town beginning to fill with the ordinary movement of people who were. Clara realized, watching from every available angle, from the feed store steps, from the dress shop window, from the mouth of the alley between the hardware and the apothecary. The whole town was watching. Crow seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. She watched him feel the weight of it, 30 years of standing at the center of this town's regard, and now standing in this street alone. And the regard was still there, but it had changed its character entirely. He looked at Clara. He looked at Elias. He looked at the street, at the faces watching him, at the ordinary Tuesday morning of a Colorado frontier town that had decided overnight that it wanted to know the truth. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Clara said. "But you are." She said it quietly. She said it without triumph, without heat, without the performance of a woman who had won something. She said it the way you say a true thing, when you have earned the right to say it plainly, with the full weight of everything it cost to get there behind it. Nathaniel Crow looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, and the main street of Millhaven watched him go, and no one moved to follow him, and no one moved to stop him. And the morning continued with the particular brightness of a day that was going to matter when people thought about it later. Elias turned back to Clara. She was shaking. She had not been shaking before she had been running on something harder and colder than feeling for the last 18 hours. But it was over now, or over enough, and her body had decided that the emergency was sufficiently concluded to begin presenting the bill. Elias took one look at her and said, "Sit down." "I'm fine." "Clara," just her name, and then, "Please." She sat on the steps of the feed store. She put her hands on her knees and looked at the street and breathed. Elias sat beside her, not close, not inappropriately close, but close enough that she could feel the solidity of him next to her, the simple physical fact of another person who was not going anywhere. "The halcyon man is still coming," she said. "He'll find a judicial hold and a wire from Cole waiting for him." "We don't know that Cole responded." "We don't know that he didn't," Elias said. Clara looked at the street. She looked at the ordinary Tuesday morning of a town that was still deciding what it believed about itself. She thought about 8 families. She thought about the Harmons and the Pells and Tom Bridger who had left and not come back. She thought about Pete Halley with his lunch pail and Frank Ellison with his 4-year-old papers, and the particular courage of ordinary people who had kept records without knowing why and told the truth without knowing if it would matter. "What happens if Hendricks doesn't rule in my favor?" she said. "What happens if Cole doesn't respond and the hold doesn't hold and Crow finds another way?" Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then we find another way after that." She looked at him. "It's not your land." "No," he said. "But you are. And I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. 11 months of bread and coffee and fence posts and quiet evenings. 11 months of a man sitting on the other side of a porch and being present in the particular way that some people are present. Not noisily, Not with demands, but with the steady, undemonstrative reliability of someone who shows up without being asked and stays without needing to be thanked. She had been so careful not to name what that was. She had been careful for practical reasons, and for proud reasons, and for the reason that she was still underneath everything, a woman who had loved a good man and buried him, and was not entirely sure she had the right to need another one. Elias said nothing. He sat beside her on the feed store steps in the morning sun of a town that was still in the process of deciding something about itself, and he let her think. And he did not fill the silence with anything. It didn't need, and that she thought was exactly what she meant when she thought about him at all. She did not say any of that. Instead, she said, "I need to go check on the wheat." "I know," he said. "Will you come?" He looked at her. The something behind his eyes that she had been carefully not naming was there again, older and more deliberate than anything she had expected to find in this hard, dry, unforgiving country. "Yes," he said, "I'll come." They stood. They walked to their horses. The morning continued, and 4 miles away the wheat moved in the wind. Patient and golden, waiting for a harvest that was for the first time in a long time allowed to be sure of itself. The wheat was still standing. Clara walked the east field with her hand trailing through the stalks the way she had done since she was a girl, following her father through the same rows, and she counted the days in her head, 12 more, maybe 14. If the night stayed cool, and the wheat told her what it always told her when she listened carefully enough. It said, "I am here. I have always been here. Whatever happens in town, I am still here." Elias walked the row beside her without speaking. That was the thing about him. She had understood first before she understood anything else that he knew when words were a kindness, and when they were an intrusion. He walked beside her and looked at the wheat and let the field do what fields do, which is tell you the truth without language. "It's a good crop," he said finally. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." They stood at the far end of the east field, where the diversion had cut the water and left a strip of shorter, thinner stalks along the boundary, visible proof of what had been stolen, right there in the growing itself. She looked at that strip and felt the anger move through her clean and cold, the way honest anger moves when it hasn't been contaminated by self-pity. "I want to restore that section," she said. "Next season. I want to put in a proper intake independent of the county channel if I have to dig it myself." "You won't have to dig it yourself," Elias said. She looked at him. "I wasn't asking." "I know you weren't," he said. "I was offering. There's a difference." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the field. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." They rode back to her house in the late morning, and she made coffee, and they sat at her table and did not talk about Crow or the judge or the wire to Denver or any of the things that were still unresolved, because there was nothing more to do about those things until something happened, and talking about them would not make them happen faster. Instead, they talked about the irrigation, about where a new intake could be dug, about the grade of the land, about the water table, which Elias knew from 30 years of working the same county soil. He drew the channel line with his finger on the table, tracing the route the water would take, and Clara watched his hands and thought about how much a person could know about a place just from staying in it, long enough to pay attention. She was refilling his cup when the rider came. She heard the horse before she saw it, fast, not leisurely, not the pace of ordinary business. She set the coffee pot down and went to the window, and felt her stomach tighten one more time with the particular dread of someone who has been receiving bad news at intervals and has not yet reached the interval where the news is good. It was Simmons, the telegraph operator. He pulled up at her gate and called her name before he had finished dismounting. Clara went to the door. "Wire came back," Simmons said out of breath, holding out the folded paper. "From Denver. Came through 20 minutes ago, and I rode straight here." He paused. "Thought you'd want to see it quick." She took it. Her hands were steady. She did not know how they were steady because the rest of her was not, but her hands were, and she unfolded the paper and read it. The wire was from Alderman Cole, Chief Title Officer, Denver and Pacific Railroad. It was brief and professional, and it said exactly what she had gambled everything on it saying. Cole stated that upon receipt of her communication and upon consultation with the Denver and Pacific's legal counsel, all pending land acquisitions in Jefferson County, Colorado, associated with the Halcyon Land and Development account, had been placed on administrative hold pending title verification. He stated that a representative of the Denver and Pacific's legal department would be traveling to Millhaven within 48 hours to examine the title records in question. He stated that the Denver and Pacific Railroad did not and would not accept contested or legally encumbered property as part of its right-of-way acquisition program, and that if the Halcyon account was found to have provided titles obtained through fraudulent means, the Denver and Pacific would pursue full contractual remedy. He had also, at the bottom of the wire, included one additional line that was not professional and not formal, and was clearly written by a man who understood exactly what she had done and why. It read, "Your instinct to contact us directly was correct. The railroad owes you a clean transaction or nothing at all." Clara read it twice. She folded it. She turned around. Elias was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room watching her face, and he read her face the way he had learned to read the land without hurry, with full attention. "Well," he said. She held out the wire. He read it. He read it again. He lowered it and looked at her. And something moved through his expression that was too large and too complicated for a single name relief and pride. And something else she was not going to try to identify right now, because there was still work to do. She turned to Simmons, who was still on her porch with his hat in his hands. "Thank you," she said, "for riding out." "Figured it mattered," Simmons said simply. He took back his copy and put his hat on and mounted his horse and rode back toward town with the easy satisfaction of a man who has done the right thing and does not need to make a speech about it. Clara and Elias looked at each other. "It's not over," she said. It had become something of a habit between them, her saying it, him not arguing with it because it was always true, and they both knew it, and there was comfort in naming the truth out loud, even when the truth was inconvenient. "No," he said. But Crow's finished, and that was different. That was the first time either of them had said it with the full weight of certainty behind it, and it sat in the air of her kitchen, and took up the space that the fear had been occupying, and the fear did not come back to fill it. They rode into Millhaven that afternoon, because there were things that needed to be seen to, not because the crisis demanded it, but because life continued, and the crisis was not all that life was made of. Clara needed flour. Elias needed to check on a fence supply order. These were ordinary errands, and she did not let herself feel strange about needing ordinary things in the middle of an extraordinary week, because her father had told her once that the sign of a person who would survive hard times was whether they remembered to eat during them. The town felt different. She had been in this town her whole life, and she knew its moods. The way you know the moods of a person you live with by the small things, not the obvious ones. The way people stood, the speed of conversations, the particular quality of eye contact. Millhaven had always had a certain unspoken order to it, a hierarchy that everyone understood and mostly accepted, because the alternative was conflict, and conflict was expensive. Nathaniel Crow had been near the top of that order for 30 years, and the order had adjusted itself around him the way water adjusts around a stone in a riverbed. The stone had moved. It had not been removed yet. Clara knew that. Crow was still in town, still in his house, still technically the owner of his bank. But the water was moving differently now, finding new paths, and the people of Millhaven were navigating those new paths with the careful, slightly uncertain energy of people who have discovered that a thing they thought was permanent was actually just persistent. George Tripp stopped her in front of the general store. He was a blunt man, and he spoke bluntly. "Heard Cole sent a wire back," he said. "Word travels fast when Simmons rides out of town on a Tuesday morning like his britches are on fire." A pause. "That true. The railroad's holding the Halcyon purchases until the titles are verified," Clara said. "Which means my property's in that corridor too," George said. It was not a question. He had clearly done his own geography. "My east boundary sits right along the survey line." "Have you had trouble with your loan terms?" Clara asked. George looked at her steadily. "Nothing I could prove. But I've had 2 payments delayed in recording. Marsh told me it was a clerical backlog. I didn't push it. A pause. I'm pushing it now. Talk to Hendricks, Clara said. Bring your records. Already sent my wife to make copies this morning, George said. Figured it was time. He looked at her with the particular unadorned respect of a man who does not hand out acknowledgement cheaply. You did right, Mrs. Whitfield. What you did at that town hall. I told the truth, Clara said. In this town, George said, that ain't always the same thing as doing right. Took something to make it the same thing. He touched his hat and walked on. She was at the flower counter inside the general store when Margaret Fenn appeared at her elbow with the quiet, purposeful materialization of a woman who has been waiting for a specific moment and has correctly identified it. Victor Crow came to see me this morning, Margaret said. Clara looked at her. What did he want? He wanted to see the records I brought to the town hall, the pattern of defaults I documented. Margaret set a small jar of preserves on the counter with the manner of someone conducting 2 transactions simultaneously. He's building a list. Every family Crow took land from. He wants to provide it to Hendricks's review and to the Denver and Pacific legal team when they arrive. Clara was quiet for a moment. He came to you on his own. On his own, Margaret confirmed. Showed up at my door before 8 this morning, looking like he'd slept in his coat and hadn't eaten since yesterday. She looked at Clara with eyes that had been reading people for 60 years and were not often wrong. He's not doing this for you specifically. He's doing it because he decided to be a different kind of man, and that kind of decision has a momentum to it once it starts. She picked up the preserves. I gave him what he asked for, and I gave him breakfast. He needed the breakfast more than the records, I think. Clara thought about Victor Crow at her kitchen table 2 mornings ago, turning his hat in his hands and saying, I knew. She thought about the courage that lived inside that admission, not the dramatic courage of a man standing in a street, but the slower, harder courage of a man looking at his own reflection and deciding he did not like what he saw. Tell him, Clara said slowly, that I appreciate what he's doing, and that if he needs anything, any document, any testimony I can provide, he should ask. Margaret looked at her with something warm in her eyes. I'll tell him, she said. He'll need to hear it. The Halcyon representative arrived on the afternoon train as Victor had predicted. His name was Beckett, and he was a tall man in a good suit who carried a briefcase and had the expression of someone who had traveled a significant distance, expecting a straightforward transaction, and had been informed somewhere between Denver and Millhaven that the transaction was considerably less straightforward than advertised. He went directly to the Crow Bank. He was inside for 40 minutes. When he came out, he went directly to Judge Hendricks's office. He was inside for 20 minutes. When he came out of that, he went to the telegraph office. Clara did not see any of this directly. She heard it from Caleb Ward, who had positioned himself near the telegraph office with the transparent pretense of needing to send a wire to his brother in Kansas, and who reported back to her at the general store with the slightly embarrassed satisfaction of a man who has been doing exactly what he said he wasn't doing. Beckett sent 2 wires, Caleb said. Long ones. I didn't see the content, but he was in there a good while. A pause. And he didn't look happy when he came out. He talked to Hendricks, Clara said. For 20 minutes, Caleb confirmed. Hendricks has that hold order on every Crow Bank deed transfer. Beckett can't take possession of anything until the review is complete, and if the review finds what it looks like it's going to find... Caleb paused, doing the arithmetic. Halcyon's going to have a problem explaining to the Denver and Pacific how they acquired 8 properties with compromised titles. Halcyon knew, Clara said quietly. Caleb looked at her. You think so? I think a land company that pays a small-town banker a percentage to identify and manufacture defaults on frontier properties does not do so in ignorance of what it's buying, Clara said. I think Halcyon knew exactly what Crow was doing and found it convenient that they didn't have to do it themselves. Caleb was quiet for a moment. That's a bigger thing than I thought this was. Yes, Clara said. It is. It was bigger than she had thought, too, when she walked across a field with a loaf of bread 3 days ago. She had thought she was fighting for her 40 acres. She was. But she was also, without having planned it, without having intended it, the crack in a wall that had been holding back 3 years of accumulated wrong. The Harmons. The Pells. Tom Bridger, who packed up and left because he didn't have the fight left in him. 8 families, possibly more, who had lost their land to a scheme so carefully constructed that each individual piece of it looked like ordinary business misfortune. She thought about each of them that evening, sitting at her own kitchen table with her ledger closed and her coffee hot, and the sound of the wheat field moving outside her window in the Colorado night air. She thought about what it would mean to get those properties back, whether that was even possible, whether the law had enough reach to undo what had been done, whether a fraud investigation that started with one widow's account book could grow large enough to matter to people who were already gone. She did not know the answer to those questions. She was not a lawyer, and she was not a judge, and she was not a railroad executive. And the things that happened next would happen in rooms she might not be invited into with language she had not been taught and processes she had not been trained in. But she had started it, and that was something. That was not nothing. The knock at her door came after dark. She had not expected anyone, and she went to it with her hand on the lamp, and when she opened it, Elias was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. Not the steadiness, not the quiet patience, but something underneath those things that had been there all along and had finally, on this particular evening, decided it was done waiting. "I need to say something," he said. Clara looked at him. "Come in." "I'd rather say it out here," he said, "if you don't mind." She stepped out onto the porch. The night was clear and cold the way Colorado nights went clear and cold in late spring, and the stars were the extravagant kind that only appeared when you were far enough from town to see them properly, and the wheat field was a dark, moving presence at the edge of the yard. Elias looked at his hat. He looked at her. He was not a man who had trouble with words. She had known that for 11 months had sat with him through enough conversations to know that he chose words carefully and used them well. But he was having trouble now, and she watched him have it without rushing him, because this felt like something that needed to arrive at its own pace. "I told you I'd been sitting on the wrong side of the fence line too long," he said. "You did," she said. "I meant it about the land. About not getting involved when I should have." He paused. "But I meant it about other things too. Things I've been sitting on the wrong side of for 3 years. He looked up. "You know what I'm talking about." "I think I do," Clara said. "I'm 46 years old," Elias said. "I've got gray hair and a mortgage and a cattle operation that runs on about 14 hours of sleep a week. I'm not young. I'm not easy. I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not the kind of man a woman writes a story about." "Elias," Clara said. "Let me finish," he said. "Not sharp, just necessary. I've been telling myself that for 3 years, that I was too old, that too much time had passed since Margaret died, that whatever I felt when you walked across that field with your bread and your impossible stubbornness was sentiment or loneliness or some foolishness that a man my age should know better than to take seriously." He looked at her with the full, unguarded directness of a man who had decided that whatever the answer was, he preferred it to the waiting. "And then you stood in that town hall and told the truth when the truth was the most expensive thing in the room. And I watched you do it. And I thought, I am done sitting on the wrong side of this fence." The night was very quiet. The wheat moved. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, who had loved her with the solid, unglamorous faithfulness of a man who showed up every day. She thought about 2 years of managing alone, of being called the poor widow, of being offered Victor Crow as a solution. She thought about 11 months of bread and coffee and fence posts, and a man who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. "I counted something these past 11 months, she said. "Every time you showed up without being asked. Every time you did the thing that needed doing without making it about what you'd done." She paused. "I counted 43 times. Elias looked at her. "You counted." "I'm a woman who keeps records," she said. "It's what I do." Something moved across his face that started as surprise and became something entirely different. the particular expression of a man who has been seen fully and clearly by someone who kept the evidence. "Clara," he said. "Her name. Just that." "I don't need to be rescued," she said. "I've been clear about that." "I know," he said. "I wasn't offering rescue." "I know what you were offering," she said. "I've known for a while. I was—" She stopped. "I was afraid that wanting it meant I'd become someone who needed it. And I don't need it. But I've decided that wanting something you don't need is not weakness. It's just being human, Elias. It's just being alive." He took one step toward her, stopped, gave her the space she always gave herself to make her own decision. She reached out and put her hand on his arm. Not a dramatic gesture, not a sweeping romantic thing, just the simple, deliberate act of one person reaching toward another and saying with their body what was too large for words right now. "If you had been younger," she said quietly, "maybe you would have spoken sooner." "If I had been younger," Elias said, "I might not have become the man you trusted." She looked at him. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were extravagant, and the wheat field moved at the edge of everything patient and present and alive. "Stay for coffee," she said. "Yes," he said. "I will." 3 weeks later, Judge Hendricks issued his ruling. It came on a Thursday morning, posted at the courthouse door, and read aloud by Hendricks himself to the crowd that had gathered because word had traveled the night before that the ruling was coming, and the whole county had collectively decided to be present for it. The ruling invalidated the Crow Bank's claim on the Whitfield property on the grounds of documented fraud, specifically the deliberate rejection of tendered payments to manufacture a default and the unauthorized diversion of county irrigation water to suppress the property's productive yield. The ruling stated that the actual remaining debt, as calculated from Clara's ledger and verified against the bank's own underlying records, was $183, and that this amount was to be considered satisfied in full by the fraudulent losses Clara had sustained through the water diversion. Her debt was gone. Her land was hers, unencumbered in full. The crowd outside the courthouse made a noise that was part cheer and part something else, something more complicated, the sound of a community reckoning with what it had allowed to happen and deciding to feel, at least for this morning, that the reckoning was enough. That was not all the ruling said. Hendricks had expanded the review as he had promised, and the expanded review had found what Clara had believed it would find. 6 of the 8 properties identified in Victor Crow's list showed evidence of similar manipulation. The Harmon family's South 40. The Pell's homestead. 3 other properties that had been quietly absorbed and resold to Halcyon before anyone had thought to look closely. And Tom Bridger's land, which Halcyon had already graded for a rail approach, and which the Denver and Pacific's legal team had spent the better part of 2 weeks determining how to handle. The Denver and Pacific, it turned out, did not want the liability. Cole's team had examined the title chain and found it contaminated at multiple points, and the railroad had made the calculation that a clean right-of-way acquired through legitimate purchase was worth more to them than a faster route with legal exposure baked into every acre. They withdrew from the Halcyon account entirely. Halcyon's Denver office was under state investigation before the month was out. Nathaniel Crow surrendered his banking license on a Friday afternoon with his lawyer beside him and said nothing to the people watching. Victor was not there. Victor had been in Hendricks's office for most of that week, providing testimony, providing documents, providing the interior view of an operation that had been built over 30 years and had disguised itself as a legitimate institution for so long that even the people running it had half believed the disguise. He came to see Clara the day after his father surrendered the license. He knocked at her door in the early evening, and she let him in, and they sat at the same kitchen table where he had sat 3 weeks ago, with his hat in his hands, and told her the truth. "He hasn't spoken to me," Victor said. "No," Clara said. "I didn't expect him to." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about my mother, wondering if she knew more than I thought she knew, wondering if she kept quiet for the same reasons I did." He looked at his hands. "I'll never know now." "You could decide to believe the best of her," Clara said. Victor looked up. Is that honest, though? When you don't know? It's kind, Clara said. And sometimes kind is the most honest thing you can manage when the truth is gone, and all you've got left is what you choose to carry. She paused. Your mother sounds like she was a woman who believed things should be done correctly. I think you're doing that now. I think she'd recognize it. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. Clara, she said. He almost smiled. Clara, he said. He left, and she stood on her porch and watched him ride away into a Colorado evening that was warm for the first time all spring, and she thought about the strange turns that brought people to moments of honesty and the different costs that honesty carried for different people. And she thought that there was something worth respecting in a man who paid the cost without asking for credit. Elias was at the fence line when she walked across the field. She had not brought bread. There was no bread today, no ritual, no prop for a visit. She didn't need a reason for any more. She walked across because she wanted to, and because the evening was warm, and because he was there. He looked up when he heard her coming, and straightened from the fence post, and waited the way he always waited, with patience, without performance. Hendricks is ruling, she said. It's final. I know, he said. Caleb Ward told me this morning. Of course he did. She stopped at the fence. The land is clear. The debt is gone. Yes, he said. And the East Field needs a new intake before next season. I've been thinking about that, he said. I've got a plan for the grade, if you want to hear it. I want to hear it, she said. He told her about the grade standing at the fence in the warm spring evening, with his hands moving to describe the channel path, and she listened and asked questions, and he answered them, and they stood there talking about water and land and the practical management of an honest life. And it was the most ordinary conversation in the world, and it was the best conversation she could remember having. At the end of it, Elias looked at her across the fence, and she looked at him, and the wheat field moved between their properties in a long, slow wave, and the evening was the color of everything that grows. I've been thinking, he said. About the fence, she said. About the fence, he said. Specifically, about how long I've been treating it like a boundary instead of a formality. Clara looked at him. And I think, Elias said, that a man who has spent 3 years sitting on the wrong side of a fence line ought to do something about it, when the woman on the other side is willing. She's willing, Clara said. He stepped through the gap in the wire. That was all. That was everything. He stepped through the gap and stood beside her in the warm Colorado evening, and she looked at the 40 acres of wheat that her father had built, and her husband had worked, and she had fought for, and kept, and she thought about all the things it had cost, and all the things it had given back, and she understood, standing there in the ordinary miracle of a field that had survived, that this was what the frontier actually was, underneath the hardship and the loneliness, and the men with papers, and the manufactured disasters. It was the place where people who refused to be made smaller found out how large they actually were. The wheat moved. The evening held. And Clara Whitfield stood on her own land beside the man she had chosen, and knew, with the full and absolute certainty of a woman who keeps careful records, that what she had was real, what she had built was hers, and what she had survived had not diminished her by a single inch. It had only shown her, and everyone watching, exactly how much of her there had always been. Some people measure love by how quickly it comes. Clara had learned to measure it by how steadily it stays through drought and fraud and fear, and the long, unglamorous work of surviving with your dignity intact. That was the only measure that had ever mattered on the frontier, and it was the only measure she intended to use for the rest of her life. She had earned that right. She had paid for it honestly. And no one, not a banker, not a railroad, not a town that had underestimated her, was ever going to take it from her again.